Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Meridy. I'm the Executive Director here at DOROT. I'm so glad that you can join us this afternoon. Thanks for braving the elements to join us today. I want to thank the over 250 people who are on Zoom today to participate in today's program. And I am just so grateful for M.T. Connolly for joining us today for this wonderful program. A few housekeeping issues. For those of you who are here in the building, we have one restroom at the end of the hall right after the stairs. We have two more that are on the lower level. And for those of you who use a hearing aid, we do have a hearing loop here, and if you set it to T, that will improve the overall sound for everybody who is here. We're going to leave some time for questions and answers. For those of you who are in the room, you should have an index card and a pen that was on your seat, so feel free to write down your questions. The staff will come through and pick up the cards towards the end of the program. And then for those of you who are online, you can use the chat and you can write your questions in the chat, and we have staff that are curating all of those questions, and then we'll be able to get to as many as we possibly can. So I just want to welcome you to DOROT. So M.T. Connolly is a remarkable leader in the field of aging. She has been a leader in the elder justice arena in terms of really making sure that older adults are protected. She's the author of this fabulous book, The Measure of Our Age, Navigating Care, Safety, Money, and Meaning Later in Life. She's a MacArthur Genius Award recipient, and we are just absolutely thrilled to have her here. The book I found to be incredibly interesting, informative, and really accessible. There are some significant topics that are included. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but just to give you a sense, she talks about the longevity revolution, challenges in aging, healthcare issues, independence, vulnerabilities for people growing older. And most importantly, in my mind, is the finding purpose and meaning as one ages. And I think that that's really one of the hallmarks of DOROT, is that our mission is to address the issue of social isolation and loneliness, and we provide people an opportunity to stay socially engaged and connected and to be involved with the community in a meaningful way. So welcome to DOROT.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So why don't we start our conversation in terms of what motivated you to write this book?
Well, first, thank you for having me. I'm so impressed by all that DOROT does, and that I'm honored there's so many of you here. And I grew up in Minnesota, so it's in Minnesota-like weather here. And to Mark and Claire, many thanks. So as Mark knows, I'm a recovering lawyer. I started my career at the Department of Justice, and then when I didn't really want to litigate anymore, I ended up running something that was initially called the Nursing Home Initiative, and then we wanted to broaden it out because initially we focused on problems that happen in nursing homes, and particularly large chains of nursing homes. And then it became really clear that what happens in long-term care has everything to do with how we age in other settings, and how, what are the intersections, how does it all fit together? And so that kind of led me toward looking at the laws that affect aging and what goes wrong in aging. So I made my way over to Congress, worked on a law called the Elder Justice Act, and that ended up languishing for 8 years, and then was enacted with the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, in 2002, but with no money for 5 years, and then really what are just rounding errors. And so the lesson for me was that even working for two of the most powerful institutions in the country, the Department of Justice and Congress, and using the lever of the law, which is a very powerful lever that I had really what I consider to be very disappointing, a disappointing impact in terms of moving the needle in our well-being as we age. And so that really made me take note that something deeper must have been going on. And so I wanted to really dive into understanding more about aging. And what is it that we think about? What is the history of the different programs? How have we handled it? And so the book ends up being really, I think it's very hard to put on a 3x5 card, but to the extent that I sort of have thought about how to do that, it's really that we underestimate the power of aging. And as a result, we're unprepared both for the challenges, which are quite substantial, but also for the gifts, which are equally substantial. And that having more knowledge can really improve our odds of having a better old age. And so having learned a bunch about aging in terms of both my work and the research for the book, I thought, okay, I'm going to try and put it into the, write about that stuff, and why aging is harder than it should be, and maybe some ways that we can think about it in different ways and improve, and improve our capacity to plan and our knowledge about it.
Terrific, thank you. So we are living in unprecedented times. And as you point out in your book, we're living in unprecedented times in a variety of ways, but we're living in unprecedented times with the longevity revolution. People are living longer than any time in human history. And as MT has pointed out in the book, that since 1900, we have added 30 years on average to Americans' lives here in the United States, but an additional 30 years. And that is just really incredible. So just in fact, here at DOROT, we have 595 people who participate in our programs who are between the ages of 90 and 99. We also have 83 people who are over the age of 100, and the oldest person is 106 or 107, which is just pretty remarkable. So what are some of the implications of people living so much longer than we have ever in human history?
Yeah, it's such an important thing to think about, because really the demographic revolution affects every single aspect of society. So just drilling down on the numbers that Mark was talking about, in 1900, the average Americans lived an average of 48 years. By 2000, and still today, we live an average of 78 years. But there's some, there are some asterisks there. Those years, or our well-being, is not equitably distributed among the population. And also, age span is not the same as how long we're healthy. And so the average health span, as it's called, is about 66 years. And again, that is not equally distributed among the population in terms of race, ethnicity, education, well-being, SES, and the like. But that shifting of the age of the American population cuts across every single sector of society. So our health system, the way we work, our financial system, housing, and interestingly also sort of ethics and philosophy. And one of the things that was really striking to me was the extent to which autonomy safety issues are really profound as we age. And not only because of cognitive decline, but because different people assess risk in different ways. There's a wonderful saying that goes, we want safety for the people we love and autonomy for ourselves. And anybody who has raised a teenager or loved a teenager or been a teenager knows that, but we also know it in terms of our own families. My own kids are now, they assess risk a little differently for me than I assess risk for myself. I took a pretty substantial fall a couple of years ago and was, couldn't put any weight on my leg. And my kids were like, Mom, we need to talk about either the medication or the walking or whatever else it was. And so it was interesting to feel the shoe on the other foot. But that stuff is all over in terms of every single aspect of society. Like when people assess their own risk differently than the people they love or than our laws do, how do we make those balances? And that's one of the things that we're also really unprepared for in terms of how we age. And I think about it a little bit like climate change, really, that it's very slow, it's very incremental, and it's absolutely universal in terms of the impact on our lives and on our society and on our culture. And so we haven't really kept up very well in any aspect of aging, and we need to do a much better job on that.
Thank you. One of the really the major components of the book talks a lot about caregiving and the importance of caregiving and the challenges of caregiving. But one of the things that I really loved with the way that you start the book is you talk a little bit about your father. And I was wondering if you could just read some of that passage where you're able to talk about your father at the beginning of the book.
One of the things about working in aging is that it's always both professional and personal. So here's the chapter 1, after the prologue, but chapter 1. Like a shift in the seasons, it's hard to pinpoint the moment when things begin to change as time and need recast our relationships and then recast them again. But whoever we become as adults, some part of who we were with our parents shadows us if they live long enough to need our care. The role exists in a time warp, one that millions of us will at some point inhabit. The more I learned about aging, the more caregivers assumed center stage. They often determined whether older people in ebbing health flourished or came to harm. Their contributions, most unpaid or underpaid, are measured in hours and days, in years and decades. Their work is composed of countless tasks rendered from near and from afar. There's little discussion, let alone consensus, about profound questions that attend the work. What should be expected of caregivers? Can they meet the high demands? At what cost to them or the people they care for? For how much, if any, compensation? And with what guidance and support should they be entitled to receive? Similar questions rumbled through my own family. When he rounded 90, my father said he'd lived longer than anyone else in his family ever had. That's true in many families these days. His frailty snuck up on me. It was discombobulating. He had always been so dominant, so unyielding. He had disapproved of my choices and was shocked when I didn't bend to his wishes about religion or profession. For him, those demands were existential. Good children acceded to their parents' wishes. He hadn't counted on the provocations of raising a family in a world so different than the one he'd known. But those grueling years of conflict had long since healed over. Old age and frailty brought forth a new pacifism and sweetness in him, and in me a new tenderness for him, mingled with anticipatory grief, a little like the sensation when you first notice that the leaves have begun to fall.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about caregiving, because the caregiving really touches everybody. It touches immediate family members. It touches upon community at large. And we have not necessarily met the needs of caregiving. So could you talk a little bit about some of the caregiving issues that you write about in your book?
Sure. I had a wonderful editor who, when we talked about it, was we have this victory of long lives, but we don't really quite know what to do with it. And I think caregiving is a perfect example of that. So as more and more of us live deeper into old age, our years exceed our health. And that means that tens of millions of us are going to need more care than ever before. So where does all that care come from? You know, it's talked about as a workforce issue. It's talked about in all sorts of other ways. But most people don't want to go to facilities, right? We don't want that. And part of that is, I think, a failure of imagination in terms of our ability to keep up with our aging demographics, because we want to live in community, right? Mark started off talking about how important it is to avoid isolation. The problem is we don't have good enough options, and my friends and I spend a decent amount of time talking about what kinds of options do we want. How do we want to live in community with other people, but also in a place where you can get some care and some help, and you can stay, and you can have, you know, it has, W.H. Auden has a wonderful line, the furniture of home, so that it feels like home, but is a place where you can also get care. So I think that is one place where we're going to have to do a lot to figure out how to age well. Right now, in addition, in terms of care, you know, we have lots of pediatricians, but the same thing, you know, they say that kids aren't just young adults in the same way as older people aren't just older adults. We have different kinds of medical needs, different kinds of metabolisms. We metabolize drugs differently, et cetera, and yet we have an incredible shortage of geriatricians, even though the data are super clear that having good comprehensive geriatric care improves independence, well-being, and health dramatically. And so it doesn't make any sense, and it has to do, again, with the way that we structure medicine, you know, what we reward, what are the like desirable neighborhoods of medicine. Generally not geriatrics, right? It has a low status, and that is because of the way that comes from the culture, comes from how we think about aging and primary care. So it's so that's another aspect of care. But I think maybe the most important one is that a lot of people, either for economic reasons, long-term care is not covered by Medicare, and most people can't afford long-term care insurance. Tens of millions of people need long-term care. So where is all that care going to come from? Mostly from family members or other informal caregivers. There are more than 50 million people, that's bigger than the population of California, providing substantial amounts of care to adults 50 and older. And we provide very, very little support for those caregivers, even though it can be a super hard job. Sometimes people are basically running pop-up ICUs in their living rooms while they're trying to, you know, get their kids to school and trying to take care of an older adult. So it's nuts the way we've organized ourselves, and we could do so much better. And we already pour tens of billions of dollars into, you know, through Medicare, through Medicaid, through other kinds of programs. We put so many funds into aging, but we don't allocate them very well. So that is that's part of the diatribe.
Thank you. One of the things that I really appreciated in the book, in chapter 7, you talk about how, as a society, we are lagging behind. So when you have young children, they go to school, they go to high school, they go to college if they're fortunate enough. They get a job, people work for their careers, then they retire. And if people are retiring, we as a society are we are lagging greatly in terms of, okay, so what do we do with all these people that are 65, 75, 85, 95, 105? So can you talk a little bit about our lack of imagination in terms of the normalization of growing older?
Yeah, happy to. And, you know, one of the things that was really striking to me is that so many of us, either individually or in our families, feel like we're failing at aging or failing at caregiving, when in fact, very often it's that society has failed us because we have not We don't have structures really that support us very well, nor do we have a way of talking about it. We don't have the social support either for aging. So when I think about the culture, I mean, it's interesting because really our longer lives, if you look at it from an evolutionary perspective, happened at lightning speed. In the 20th century, we suddenly, with hygiene and antibiotics and medication and vaccines, all kinds of stuff, figured out how to lengthen lives and really reduce childhood mortality. So it kind of makes sense. We need to be a little bit generous to ourselves also, because we haven't really caught up with ourselves from an evolutionary and cultural perspective. That said, I think about sort of the culture. There are kind of two different kinds of ways that we're lagging behind. There's the structural lagging, which is, if we think about, for example, social isolation and the way we do housing. If we think about where we live as we grow older, we have called living alone in our homes, I'm one of those people right now, as the pinnacle of success, right? We're bunkered alone in our own homes. Or we live together with other older people. What we don't have as a pervasive model, with a few little fortunate outliers in places like DOROT, is places that are encouraging us to live intergenerationally. There's this wonderful guy, Christopher Alexander, who is sort of a philosopher and architect, who said, we want to live alone and together, the generations. We want to live alone and together. And we know that intuitively, right? We have our own cohort, but we also really love and thrive on being with other people. I was here this weekend. My daughter is a musician, had a show, and my friends and my siblings and I were the oldest by several decades. And also, it was just great. And we want to have those kinds of opportunities. There's great richness. And as my kids were growing up, we had a lot of older people, older relatives, but also older friends who were part of our household, part of our friend group, part of who stayed with us, and that was tremendously enriching for them. And I think what we miss is just how important that intergenerational contact is, and how the lack of it can lead to bad things too, individually and as a society. So for example, if we think of older people as alien and sort of less than human, then of course we have different sorts of attitudes about what goes wrong and what goes right. And so, in writing the book, I was very curious about why the people I wrote about went into aging. And almost to a person, they had positive experiences with older people as they were growing up. And the American Geriatric Society, in trying to figure out how do we recruit more geriatricians, found that the people who go into geriatrics also had positive experiences with older people as they grew up. It makes total sense, right? Because then older people are part of the social fabric, are part of your community, as opposed to being other. And so we forget that it's not only important in terms of the richness of our own lives and in our own families, but also as a society, and that this incredible segregation by age, it's unbelievable how segregated we are by age. And so that in turn fosters ageism and loneliness, I think, because we've kind of ruptured the fabric. Now, there are places like DOROT, and I think it's incredible to both be focusing on reducing isolation and loneliness with intergenerationality. There's also, my friend Mark Friedman runs an organization called Co-Generate, which pairs older and younger advocates together so that there's shared activism. And I think one of the things we're also learning is to have some sort of common purpose is really important in sort of intergenerational pursuit. And that's why I grabbed all of the brochures out there to make sure that but just because there's such wonderful offerings here. So I think, the one other thing I think that's worth saying, and one thing that Mark Friedman says is, the younger people and older people are built for one another. We get very busy in the middle years of life, but kids really need older adults who are invested in them. And it is one of the markers of success is to have positive relationships with other people who aren't in your family. And older adults often have a lot of time and a lot of knowledge and ability to sort of share what they know. So in any event, that's one of my diatribes on culture.
Well, thank you. And I think that that's particularly relevant for those of us at DOROT, because DOROT is a Hebrew word which means generations. And part of our mission is to bring generations together. And I'm just very proud of the fact that we are not only bringing the generations together in a meaningful way, but we are bringing people together with very different lived experiences that never would have had an opportunity to meet one another, engage with one another. And so that's really one of the beautiful, magical pieces about DOROT, in that we engage people of all ages and that it's mutually beneficial. You know, there are many aging organizations where the older adult is the recipient, solely the recipient of services, that there is somebody who provides the service and there's the recipient. Whereas here at DOROT, it's mutually beneficial. Older adults volunteer with us to work with our teen and our college interns, and many of the volunteers who are both teen, college students, you know, people who are young, middle-aged, older, come to be able to be engaged and connected in a meaningful way. And I just love the fact that you talked about how people in the field of aging get involved because of their relationship with an older adult. So I had a beautiful relationship with my grandparents, with two of them that I knew really well. And when I was thinking about what I wanted to do professionally, and I've spent most of my career in the field of aging, it was really because of my relationship with them and because I just tend to collect old people. When I was, you know, when I was in college and I was living in D.C. in an apartment building, and I used to go out on dates with my 84-year-old neighbor, and we would go grocery shopping together. And so it's just one of those things, and I think that, you know, for the amazing staff that we have here at DOROT, you'll find people who are empathetic, compassionate, who also had an important relationship with an older adult. But what's really remarkable is that how many young people just don't have that connection. They don't, because of either family dynamics or where they live, they just don't have that connection either with a grandparent or with an older adult. I want to switch gears at this juncture to talk a little bit about the fact that there are so many people, both here at DOROT and as well as around the country, who are solo agers. In fact, DOROT has a new program which is called Aging Alone Together, which is specifically targeted at solo agers. And so one of the things that you talk about in your book is that there are lots of challenges, but that solo agers also tend to face additional challenges. Can you talk a little bit about the phenomenon of solo aging?
Sure. And it's great you have that program. And I'm a solo ager. And, you know, I think it goes to part of the conversation we're going to have in a sec relating to connection and purpose, really. There's so many more of us, but also, you know, you can be a solo ager, in fact, and be isolated together with another person. A lot of it has to do with how you organize yourself. So the way I think about it is that it's that we need to plan. We need to think about, like, what is it going to look like? We need to be willing to look at it, because one of, I think, our problems, and this is where the ageism is super insidious, is that we have a lot of denial about aging. And, old age is an age that we are not yet. It's, 10, 15 years off in the future. And that it keeps getting pushed off. And I'm as guilty as anybody about that. But we need to be willing to think about it. I mean, I have a friend, when I was starting to write this book, she's a political philosopher, and she said, big social issues require language. They require language to even conceive of them in our minds, and then to create ideas about them, and then to debate them, and then to write about them, and then to basically push for change. And so we have kind of an impoverished language even when it comes to aging. And that kind of, that is a co-conspirator with the denial because it's not a cultural norm. If, when you're in high school, everybody's talking about what happens after high school. When you're in your work, you basically get a pen and a plaque, and we do a pretty good job of planning to retirement, but not through retirement. And most of our social structures are built really with, lives that last 65 or 70 years. So many of us are going to lose partners if we had one in the first place. And so solo aging is going to become much more the norm than it is even now, and it is obviously on the increase. So what can we do? I think think about it in a clear-eyed way. Build community, build community, build community. That is super important. Also, do things for other people. Have a purpose. Sign up for the kinds of things that DOROT offers is really, really important in terms of solo aging, I think, because it's important in terms of purpose, which we'll talk about in a sec, but also in terms of tethering you to other human beings. I have two incredible nieces who grew up in Brooklyn, and one of them is in college now and is part of an intergenerational knitting group with somebody who's a solo ager. It's, it's a beautiful thing. And the other one was volunteering at the New York Public Library some years ago. So it's there are ways to do this. There's a guy named Steve Cole at UCLA who writes about, he's a scientist and writes about really the metabolic changes of having purpose and meaning in our lives as opposed to just sort of other kinds of activities. And one of the things that I really love that he said is that we have a surprising degree of unrealized control, and that we have to help people remember that when we're making plans about what we do with our lives and what we do day to day. And that is, so I think as solo agers, there are many more offerings than there were, and that a lot of it is in the planning.
Terrific. I love how your book goes through all of the different stages. And to be honest, it's a very, very straightforward, accessible book, and it's also honest. It doesn't sugarcoat things, but it's a real focus on some of the challenges. But I also love how the book concludes, where it is really all about the importance of finding purpose and meaning, and especially as we grow older. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sections in that last chapter about meaning making, purpose, curiosity, awe, and storytelling. You don't have to do all of them because we want to make sure we have time for questions. But I think that it really, I think it's such an important way for us to be picking up on what you just said, picking up on the way in which we think about growing older.
One of the things I was really struck by is that it's something called the longevity paradox. We want to get old, we don't want to be old. And it's like, well, what's the point then? And so I really wanted to struggle. I wanted to figure out like what's going on there. And we pay way more attention to sort of, our knees and our medications and our health insurance. and less to what are we doing it for? Like, why do we want more time if we're going to have all this fear and loathing about aging? I mean, time is the most sacred gift we have. And so I wanted to kind of shift how I was thinking about it, but that's like kind of abstract. And so I did a ton of research into how is it that we make meaning of our lives, because I wanted it to be more quantifiable, really, and accessible. And what that did was really, it was sort of surprising to me, because I'm kind of camped out in more the challenges part of aging, but that there are really accessible ways that we can move the needle in terms of making meaning, if we just kind of shift our focus a little bit. So there were 5 things, as Mark just went through, and I am going to talk about all 5, but I'll do it fast. The first is connection and love. And connection is basically just being with other human beings, especially ones you care about, and also just, things like this, being in community with other human beings. And the people who do research on this stuff, there's this Harvard study of human development. It's unbelievably clear that investing in the relationships that are most important to you is the most important thing you can do in your life. And, when we make our New Year's resolutions, do we think about that? Very rarely. It's usually about diet or, whatever, my checklist. It's not about, okay, who's most important to me and how am I going to make sure that I have meaningful relationships with them? Most important thing. Second is purpose. We have time. We want to fill it with things that matter to us. And most of that is in terms of, often that means giving back. But it can mean all kinds of different things to different people. So really doing your own inventory about what matters to you is incredibly important. And again, this guy, Steve Cole, found that people who volunteered with kids at risk had significant health benefits over people who just sort of did pleasure-seeking kinds of activities, on the order of stopping smoking or diet or exercise, all the good things, right? So actually investing in those kinds of things is really good for you. There's a kind of amazing study called the Plant Study that was done in the 70s, where nursing home residents were given a plant. Yes, exactly. Yeah, she's amazing. She has other amazing studies too. But so half the people were basically told, okay, nurse is going to take care of your plant. Other half were told, okay, you take care of your plant wherever you want to put it, however you want to water it, blah, 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 blah. The people who who were taking care of their own plants had much better health outcomes at the end of the year, right? I mean, purpose, it can be quite simple. The third thing is, it's sort of a mashup, I think of it as sort of curiosity, creativity, and play. Older age is a really wonderful opportunity to re-access a lot of that stuff that sometimes in the busy middle sections of life you have less time for. I have a friend named Ann Basting who works on, she has a wonderful organization called Time Slips. And her tagline is, forget memory, try imagination. But I went to a play that she staged in a nursing home in Kentucky, in a Medicaid-funded nursing home. And going to Mark's point about, it wasn't just like doing something for people. It was the residents and the staff and these artists all putting on a play together. It was incredibly moving, and it wasn't just like a one-off performance. It was people creating something together. And that is tremendously, I think, generative and hopeful and, connects us to something very deep inside of us. Fourth is awe. And that is like that, feeling that you get when you look at the night sky or the Grand Canyon or an amazing snowstorm, or some people, for some people it's religious, for some people it's meditation, it can be spirituality, but it's those things that make us feel very small in the face of a huge universe. And there's kind of a paradox there. And there are researchers at Johns Hopkins that are doing the same thing with psychedelics. And the theory is that we have these really noisy egos that are constantly telling us we're not good enough, we haven't done something right, we said the wrong thing, we haven't, all the things that we, are constantly castigating ourselves for. But if we think of ourselves as these teeny little flecks, as part of this huge universe, you can kind of turn down the noise in our egos, and we can be more forgiving to ourselves, and that is at least the theory about why awe is also incredibly healing. And there's a guy named Dacher Keltner who's actually written a book about it, which is very interesting. And then the last element that I found quite accessible, and it's clear that you guys are involved in this here too at DOROT, is storytelling. We are what the anthropologists call homo narrans. We're narrating humans. All this random stuff happens to us over the course of a life, and how we make sense of our identities and our lives is how we organize those little bits and pieces of experience and say, this really hard thing and this really amazing thing and this complicated thing, they all form who I am as a human being. There's a guy named William Breitbart at Memorial Sloan Kettering who did legacy projects with people who had terminal illnesses. But what became really clear to me in thinking about sort of the research about people who are in the last stage of life is, why don't we do this sooner? We have access to these same tools whether we have a terminal illness or not. And actually, my dad used to say that life is a sexually transmitted 100% fatal disease. So we all have a fatal disease in effect. But the storytelling is really the sacred thing, because the most sacred thing you can give another person is your attention, is to really focus on listening to who and having curiosity about who are you as a human being and how do you talk about that. And so then when you ask somebody about their stories, then you create a new shared story with them. And that is a new kind of storytelling. And so I was really struck by the power of storytelling as another way of making meaning. So there you go, my five meaning-making tips.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Before we get to taking some questions, I found a phrase in your epilogue, which for me really encapsulates much of the book. And the phrase is, "Now I faced myself anew." And can you talk about what you were experiencing when you wrote that and what you mean by this powerful phrase?
To age is to move through time and is to transform again and again and again. And at that point, when I wrote that and was feeling it, my father had just died. My mother had died some years before. My kids were out of the house. My work was changing. I was finally finishing this book, which had taken a very long time. I was starting to build a new program, which I'm engaged in now with colleagues, which is really exciting, called Rise. And it was like, oh, wow, this is a new chapter of my life. And also, it's, we are always entering new chapters of our lives. And to think of it as a gift and an opportunity is really, it helped me sort of get my head on straight, I think. And one thing that Mark and I were talking about is, I now have adult children. And one of the transformations that's been really striking for me is that it's not just them who are going through transformations, it's me as a parent. And if I still want to be that mom who's like, yeah, you're going to do it my way because I'm the mom, then that's going to have a real impact on what kind of relationship I have with them and whether they want me around or not. And so we've entered into what I think of as sort of a power sharing kind of relationship. At Thanksgiving, I'm now the sous chef, which I love. But we haven't done a very good job with that as a country. in terms of sort of the power sharing between the older and the younger people in Congress or in administrations. And I think we need to think about that there's real richness and opportunity if we can think about that in different ways. And so I think looking at myself anew is, it's changed since I wrote that, and it keeps on changing all the time.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much. So we have a whole bunch of questions. So I'll just start. And thank you very much for those of you who submitted questions. First question is, why don't we learn about healthy aging before we get old?
Oh, it's such a great question. There's a guy named Ron Peterson at Mayo Clinic. I grew up in Rochester, Minnesota. He's a neurologist, and he has a study on aging. And partially it's about brain changes of aging. And my dad, who is a cardiologist, had done research on that same cohort early in his career on something called endocarditis, heart disease. And so then in late life, he was a subject. He'd like to say, he would say, I like to think I'm a control. But the reason that's relevant is that Ron Peterson kept moving back the age at which they were collecting data, because what we do early in life has everything to do with our health later in life. And it's an all kind, it's diet, it's exercise, it's sleep, but it's also stress, it's community, it's, what we're learning about the social and cultural determinants of health are profound. And so if we could know that sooner, and if we could actually take actions about it sooner, I think it would have a really significant impact. I think it's because of ageism. We don't want to talk about aging. And and it really is to our detriment. There's a woman named Becca Levy at Yale who did a study about ageism, and what her findings suggest is that people who have the most positive views of aging live 7.5 years longer than people who have the most negative views of aging. And it kind of makes sense for all sorts of reasons, including that one. So yeah, we should be starting early in life, in schools. And that's why it's so important for programs like this to be engaged in schools.
Thank you. That's a perfect segue to the second question, which is, what countries do aging better, and what do they do differently?
Oh, I always get this question. When I was first writing my book, I thought I was going to do sort of some sort of comparative analysis of different countries. And then I was at the time at a place called the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And every time I thought I had a brilliant idea about some other country, someone from that country would say, "You're on drugs." No, that's not how it is. That's like some gauzy stereotype of Eastern culture or of Sweden, of whatever it is. So the answer is, I don't know. And that, when I was trying to figure out what to do next and whether to write another book, a guy named Bruce Vladeck, who is the head of what is now called the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, said you should go and do a comparative analysis in countries that look like they do a really good job with long-term care and do a really deep analysis. The problem is it's so entwined with our economic systems and how we fund healthcare, and we are just so screwed up in how we've done that. We tried to create a more Byzantine and complicated healthcare and long-term care system. I don't think we could have succeeded had we set out to try to do it. So it's so I don't know. There are obviously, Sweden and, maybe Norway and maybe, but I don't know is the answer. But we should be doing really serious analysis and trying to figure it out. What I do know is basically countries all over the world are struggling. Most first world countries or developed countries are struggling with large aging populations and haven't really figured it out either.
Thank you. You mentioned that we allocate a lot of funding for older adults lagging, but we don't allocate it well. Can you elaborate, what is it What is it allocated for, and what would your priority allocation to be?
Very generally speaking, well, the things that are reimbursable are drugs, devices, and procedures. Those are the ones, that's the way to make money in medicine. And so that stuff is reimbursed really well. And so that skews the way that medicine is provided. What we know is that good primary care improves health dramatically. And geriatrics is generally a form of primary care, although it's also kind of a specialty in the health issues of older adults. So I would shift the focus to primary care, and in particular to geriatrics, and really support those areas of medicine way more. But also to look at what are the other aspects, what are the social and cultural determinants of health. There's a whole lot we can do that isn't medicine, right? Like reducing social isolation. We know that social isolation has terrible health outcomes. Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General, wrote a whole book called Together where he goes through a lot of that data. So we shouldn't look only at the actual medicine, but also at how do we do prevention. And that's, I guess, the one other thing is that we're really good as a society at reacting to crises, and we've sort of hollowed out prevention. What we should do way better is think about prevention and well-being much earlier on. And how we reimburse, as they say, by their budgets we shall know them, right? And what we reimburse shows what we value, and a lot of times it's tied to venture capital and all sorts of stuff. I mean, and right now, private equity is buying up medicine, so it's we're not going in the right direction right now. But primary care and thinking about prevention.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. And can you speak more about the emotional stress / anxiety management around aging and caregiving?
Another super important question. One of the things we expect is that we do this with kids too. You have a baby, and we put all this investment into like what to expect when you're expecting and Lamaze and all that, and then you take the baby home and like there's really not that much support for it. And we do sort of the same thing with aging. We're like trying to make sure that people can live these really long lives, and not helping people address the very, very substantial challenges of aging. Their economic challenges, their health challenges, their psychological challenges, their housing challenges. And so, and we expect that these 50 million people who are suddenly, often very suddenly, foisted into the role of caregiver know what they're doing and know what that entails. And, my daughter was in an ICU for more than 3 months when she was born. And a lot of people are being expected to run ICUs in their living rooms. That is not easy. I can tell you from personal experience. And also, I, as is probably not a shock given my name, I grew up Catholic, and in our, we talk in terms of absolution. And when people ask me about aging, a lot of times what I'm offering more is absolution, because people are trying so hard to get it right, and they are being brought to their knees by either caregiving or trying to not put a burden on their family or their loved ones. And the problem is, it's that people feel like they're failing at aging and caregiving and not being, as opposed to, when in fact it's society that's failing them. So there are caregiver support groups. We're beginning to learn what kinds of support are provided. Some Medicaid programs provide some support for caregivers. There is a little bit of respite care. So if you are a caregiver, I think it's like any other really, really hard thing that is incredibly invisible, which is try and find other people, try and find support, don't do it alone. And that's what I was talking about earlier, which is that isolation comes in many forms. And it's not only that we're isolated as individuals, often we're isolated as dyads, or an older person and a caregiver, whether it's a loved one or, you know, a spouse or a kid or a grandkid or a neighbor. And people aren't getting the help, and bad things happen when people don't get help. And often it's unintentional because people are being pushed way too far. So there is so much more that we can do. And part of it is talking about it in advance. And it's a courageous thing to do. I know people who have family meetings, and the people who I wrote about, the geriatrician, a woman named Laura Mosqueda, often will have family meetings with her patients and their families to say, okay, you know, what do you need? Who's going to be handling the financial stuff? Who's going to fight with the insurance companies? Who's going to deal with transportation? Who's going to be bringing over meals? You know, different family members have different capacities and skill sets too. You don't want the person who knows nothing about the money to be dealing with the money, right? Or so in any event, I think respecting that it's really hard, reaching out to the person who's in the primary role. In our family, it was my sister, who I bow down before her because she was the primary caregiver, and I don't think we supported her enough. I don't think that in families, we need to ask, how are you doing? What can we do to support you? And really be there in a substantial way that acknowledges that you know that it's hard.
Thank you. I'm sorry we can't get to more questions, but what I'd like to do is I'd like to conclude the program with a reading. And I think that perhaps you could talk about something that's focused on, and really what's really beautiful about the book is really the transformational power of aging. And I think that there's some beautiful phrases. It's a very personal book. It's not just a sort of a how-to and elevating it, but I love how you've really taken this, made this a very personal account in terms of your experience. So if we could conclude with the reading.
Sure, thanks.
And we're fine on time, so we're okay.
Okay, so I won't race. One of the things, as I said earlier, is sort of this notion of transformation. Moving through time means that we are constantly evolving and transforming, and as we age together in community with other people, it's a bilateral process. We're transforming together. So that's really what I was thinking about here with my dad again. My father carried a caution born of immigration, poverty, war, and an austere youth. When he was 6 years old, his mother was taken to the hospital. He never again saw her alive. He who remembered almost everything remembered almost nothing about his mother. Probably, he said later, because he felt that she had abandoned him, so he banished her from his memory, except for 2 details. She was jaundiced when they carried her out of the house that night, and when her body was returned to lie in their parlor for 2 days, her forehead was cold when he kissed it. His father owned a pub by John Brown's shipyard on the docks of the River Clyde and Clyde Bank just outside Glasgow. As a boy, he was alone a lot. 3 older sisters were at boarding school. 2 older brothers were priests. He took refuge in books. As an adult, Daddy was a shy recluse, a motherless boy with lots of practice being alone. It was his default state. My mother's mother said that he was the only bachelor she knew with 8 kids. His charisma fooled people. The public man was confident, unpretentious, and blunt. He wielded humor with precision, a gift like perfect pitch. His baritone raised parties. He commanded tables and rooms. People wanted his approval. He doled it out sparingly and could be harsh, tyrannical even. He suffered neither fools nor hypocrites, and sometimes not his children either. When I dropped out of college or my grades weren't straight A's, he barked his disapproval, telling me I decided to be first in my class, and I was. I wrote long letters thinking, if only I explained myself better. But he didn't soften. He had opinions on many things, including what we should do with our lives, what we should believe. When I moved in with the man I would later marry, my father didn't speak with me for almost 2 years because of my open and notorious violation of the church and him. But my siblings and I had our views too, and when they collided with his, no one shrank from battle. Some Donnybrooks lasted for years. You know what they say about Irish Alzheimer's, he'd ask. You forget everything except the grudge. My father called him her Rock of Gibraltar, to which my brother Tim once said, "You mean he's a real hard ass?" And he was, both rock and hard ass. Daddy had long been intimating his mortality. He was 54 when my sister Dina was born. In toasting her baptism, he said he hoped she could soon push 2 wheelchairs simultaneously, and that he wouldn't live long enough to see her get her driver's license. On the cusp of 18 in college, I'd crashed the car the night before. But he went on living, and with the grace of time, longevity bore its gifts. We changed, he changed, old battlefields grew over, with the adult lives we hadn't ruined after all. Peace came dropping slow. I once asked if he remembered rebuking me. I decided to be first in my class, and I was. He shook his head and said, "Did I really say something so arrogant?" In his last chapter of life, of frailty, of need, of forgiveness, of reconciliation, of peace, he became a kind of sweet and open we'd never seen in him before, which opened up a new sweetness in us too. Everywhere, everyone is aging. Everywhere, someone loves someone who is growing old. Everywhere, decent people do their best or want to do their best with too little help. Wonder how to do it right. Wonder if someone will do right by them. Wonder how not to be broken by it all. Wonder if they will find the consolations of loving care and meaning. Thank you.